When it comes to travel, for many months already, we've wanted to avoid the people coming from areas where the virus is circulating. We wanted to make sure these people could not circulate to places where the virus was not circulating in order to halt the spread of this virus. And that's why we closed our borders, the external borders of Europe and the internal borders of Europe. And that is also why, during the first phase of easing the lockdown, we decided to ban trips more than 100 kilometers from one's place of residence, except for emergency reasons. Today, the virus is still very actively circulating in certain parts of the world, and that is why we have decided that until the 15th of June, we will decide with our European partners whether the external borders of Europe can open or not, for whom and when, and according to what modalities. So this decision will be taken with all the European partners by the 15th of June. Within Europe, the epidemic is slowing down. This is the case in France, but everywhere in Europe is going through the same phenomenon. So France would be favorable to a reopening of the internal borders of Europe from the 15th of June onwards, without a quarantine for people coming from other European countries. But we will impose reciprocal agreements with countries that decide to close their borders or impose quarantines on French citizens. As I explained, in France, certain trips still need greater caution, but the emergency is, of course, lower than at the beginning of the epidemic. The 100-kilometer travel limit was very useful in the last few weeks. It was very well respected by our fellow citizens. I'd like to thank them for this. But today, because the pressure is now lower, this measure is no longer justified. And so from the 2nd of June onwards, this restriction will be lifted. People will be able to travel more than 100 kilometers from their place of residence. Of course, lifting this restriction doesn't mean that everyone should lower their guard. Of course, less we travel, less the virus can spread. And so I'd like to call upon your individual responsibility and tell you can travel, you can take your yearly holidays, but as much as possible, if you can delay your travels, this would probably be a more reasonable thing to do. And so I would like to call upon all my fellow citizens to keep the same spirit of responsibility that they've shown from the beginning of this crisis. An important point for all our fellow citizens on culture, leisure and holidays. Thanks to the efforts of everyone has made to respect physical distancing, our social and cultural life, our sports life will also be able to open up gradually. From this weekend, parks and gardens will be open throughout France in orange and green zones. Wearing masks may be mandatory in many spaces. Mayors will decide this. Prefects will be able to impose a mandatory wearing of masks in public spaces. It is the local authorities which will decide this point. From the 2nd of June, we will also reopen beaches, lakes, bodies of water, museums, monuments throughout the country. And wearing masks will also be mandatory in these spaces. For certain activities, there will be a distinction. It will have to be made in the 3 weeks and this distinction will have to be made between the green and orange areas. In green zones, event venues and theaters will be able to open from the 2nd of June. I understand it will be very difficult to reopen these different venues, seeing that rehearsals couldn't take place, that the programs have been disrupted, but if they can do it, we encourage them to reopen. Physical distancing rules will have to be respected. There will have to be a specific organization of seating areas, and masks will also have to be worn. In green areas, sports activities will also be able to take place. Gyms will be reopened, as well as fitness centers. I know that this was a very a very anticipated decision. And so swimming pools will also be open from the 2nd of June. Leisure parks will also be opened as long as physical distancing is respected, and that there will be a maximum number of 5,000 people that will be able to be welcomed in the theme parks.
Theaters, gymnasiums, sports areas, swimming pools, outdoor parks. These will only be open in orange areas starting on June 22nd. Lastly, throughout France, movie houses will open starting on June 22nd. This was a request made by the theater operators themselves. They wanted this to be done nationwide at the same time so they could organize a screening of movies. So we're taking into account their request. They'll reopen on June 22nd. To emphasize the fact that our main adversary, so to speak, are big gatherings. And there's an especially big risk when these big gatherings take place in a closed area without any special and appropriate organization. Now, in open-air places, a maximum of 5,000 participants, possibly fewer, the prefects would decide. That's the number that we set. In closed, more confined areas, such as concert halls, and depending on the activity, operators will have to guarantee appropriate rules in terms of how people can physically distance themselves and the numbers of people. Again, our rationale will be one based on caution and trust. We feel that at the current stage of the epidemic, operators of locations, whether closed or open facilities, open air or not, are able themselves to decide on the ways and means to organize their venues, the way people can circulate, the way they can provide for physical distancing. If they are able to organize, then they should do this, implement things strictly. If they're not able to organize in this way and guarantee these rules, then it'd be preferable for them not to open. So it's up to the operators themselves to shoulder the responsibility, and the government departments as well, and the local governments will assist them to make sure the reopening takes place in best possible conditions. Up until June 21st, June 22nd actually, there'll be some prohibitions, still some bans in force in unorganized areas that shouldn't be organized, locations that aren't under the responsibility of a facilities manager, such as public areas. Gatherings will be limited to 10 persons. Cultural and sporting events organized in public areas will be suspended until 21 June, at least throughout the country. Discotheques, gaming halls, stadiums, racetracks that will be closed to the public until at least June 21st, as I said. Similarly, collective sports, contact sports particularly, will continue to be prohibited because, by their essence, they don't provide for physical distancing. High-level and professional sports will resume training on 22nd June using a very strict medical protocol.